So last class, where we left off about the early 1930s. And the Presbyterian Church at this time was still split between the Northern Church and the Southern Church. The Southern Church was still segregated at this time, with all the black churches being in a separate synod. Meanwhile, the Congregationalists mainly formed two bodies. You had the Congregational Christian Churches and the Evangelical Synod of North America. You had a couple other Reformed bodies, one of which was the Reformed Church in the United States, which was a German Reformed heritage group that was very similar to the Presbyterian Church, and the United Presbyterian Church of North America, which I've spoken a little bit about. It's from that weird Scottish tradition called the Covenanter Seceder tradition, and we'll hear a little bit more about them today. I've referenced them a bit each time, but we haven't really gone into much depth about them, other than to say that they're finally going to come into play tonight. John, thank you very much. So we're going to start out by talking about how the UCC came to be what it is today. So in 1934, these two German groups, the Evangelical Synod of North America, which, as I said, was more Congregationalist, but theologically had some Lutheran mixed in with their Calvinism, and the Reformed Church in the United States, which was more Presbyterian structurally, but theologically more strictly Calvinist. The two of them, after many years of decline and many of their differences kind of being pushed to the side, they voted to merge, thus creating the Evangelical and Reformed Church, the ENR Church, which you still ask some of the older ministers, Marty, and they will tell you about the old ENR days. However, not everybody approved of the merger. In 1911, a group had been formed by more conservative members of the Reformed Church called the Eureka Classis. And in 1934, when the merger happened, they refused to join and declared themselves independent. They said they were the true Reformed Church in the United States. They still exist today. They have one church in Ohio, way up in the northwestern corner in Napoleon, and have very close ties to the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, which we talked a bit about last week. But yeah, they do exist still, like I said, but just a very small denomination. Now, Beatrice Weaver McConnell was a woman who was a member of an ENR church in Pennsylvania and became the first woman to graduate from Lancaster Theological Seminary, and in 1948 was the first woman ordained to be a pastor in the ENR church. She overcame a lot of stigma to do this. Her family told her, "Don't tell people that you want to preach. They're going to think you're queer." That was what they said. And she also, what's that? Really? Your dad graduated with her? The same? Interesting. Fascinating. Really? From Lancaster? Really? Now, that's not the same as it's a seminary, though, or are they shared? Yeah, I did not think so, no.
But I did go to school
in Lancaster. All right, yeah. So thus she broke ground by being the first woman, and she would come into play later. But in 1948, the ENR and the Congregational Christian Churches, by now both of them were mainline Protestant Congregationalist bodies, created what they called the Basis of Union, which essentially said they would start into discussions about potentially merging in the future, which they finally did in 1957. They brought with them the Afro-Christian Convention, which we talked a little bit about last week, was a body of black Congregationalists, mostly located in the South. They thus became the United Church of Christ as we know it today. Now, Beatrice Weaver McConnell was on the committee that helped draft the UCC Statement of Faith, which was created in 1957, which you can still find in our worship book. Now, not everybody approved of this merger. In 1945, a conservative group called the Conservative Congregational Christian Fellowship had been formed, and they opposed this potential merger with the ENR Church. So they broke away, and they still exist as a body. Mount Zion Church up in the Beaver Creek, Xenia area, which was part of our association, broke away from the UCC back in 2005 and joined what we call the 4Cs, Conservative Congregational Christian Conference. 4Cs is much easier. So they still exist today. They are interesting in that although they promote the same ideas of church autonomy, etc., there are some things they have very strict bans on, and one of those is same-sex marriage. Now then you also had those who were scared that the basis of union in this merger with the ENR church would create a more structured polity and less congregational polity. So the National Association of Congregational Churches was created, but unlike the 4Cs, they weren't conservative or all conservative. You had a number of liberal churches in there as well, and you still do have some today. Again, they were focused more on polity than theology. They still exist as a denomination, but have even more greater emphasis on church autonomy than the UCC does. Churches did not have to be part of an association, and they also have an interesting situation where if the national body passes an item, the associations or churches can actually get a referendum going to veto that item, which you don't have in the UCC. It's a very interesting kind of structure. But the church in my parents' town up in Rockland, Maine is NACC, or NACCC. And my parents did not attend that church. They attend the UCC church one town over. Now, in 1972, William Johnson became the first openly gay man ordained by any mainline denomination, and that was in the UCC. And he founded the UCC Coalition of Lesbian and Gay Concerns. In 1985, the UCC adopted a policy encouraging churches to welcome LGBT members, and in 2005, formally allowed same-sex marriage to happen. In 2014, the coalition was renamed the Open and Affirming Coalition, which many churches are part of today. And in 2015, the following year, some folks who disagreed with the policy created an idea called the Friendly and Welcoming Churches, which just makes things even more confusing. Despite their name, they aren't actually, affirming of this kind of stuff. But that's how that came to be. Not everybody agreed, of course. In addition to the Friendly and Welcoming Churches, you had the Biblical Witness Fellowship. And they provide a conservative voice in the UCC and were responsible for recruiting a lot of evangelical pastors who did not come from UCC seminaries but came from other bodies. They also have been known, although it's not their official position, they have been known to help churches disaffiliate and find alternatives to the UCC. Some of these members in 1998 formed the Evangelical Association of Reformed and Congregational Christian Churches. Every one of these congregational bodies has the most unnecessarily long name. That's one of the issues I find, which is an active body today, but a very small one. Many of these were former ENR churches that had merged back in the 1957 merger, which tended to be more conservative than the congregational branch from the Northeast was. Now, Karen Georgia Thompson is worth mentioning. She is our current denominational president, general minister of the United Church of Christ. She was elected in 2023, and thus was the first black person, and I believe the first woman, to be general minister of the United Church of Christ. In 2025, she was elected president of the World Council of Reformed Churches, and she is actually native of Jamaica, so she's also not American-born, which is really cool. And I did not get to meet her. Did you go to the meeting at our last association meeting, which was up in Dayton? She spoke at, and I heard I was not able to be there, but I heard it was a very well. Did you go to that, Marty? You zoomed in? So we had the honor. Of course, the national office is in Cleveland, so it wasn't that too big of a drive for her to be there. Now we're going to look at the Presbyterian side of things. As I mentioned, the Southern Church was still segregated. They had all the black churches in one synod. Now, in 1951, they dissolved that synod, which allowed the presbyteries to join their geographic synods. So you still had all black presbyteries, but for once they were merged as part of the greater synod, which if you're UCC, it's like having an all-black association being part of an integrated conference. However, dissolution also meant that the one black-led synod, which had black leaders, now all control of black work was now under the white-led Board of Negro Work, which means now a lot of black people who had power had suddenly lost it. However, they did have more representation on the Synod and in the General Assembly bodies. Now, the one exception was the Presbytery of North and South Carolina. South Carolina, likes to be the special one who's behind on everything. And they refused to accept their counterpart presbyteries. Now, some white churches were fractured or even left the denomination. They argued that integration of churches was a slippery slope to forced integrations of congregations, which they said would put them out of compliance with state segregation laws. So some churches, in response to this, ended up joining the Bible Presbyterian Church, which we talked a bit about last week. 1954, Brown versus Board of Education was passed, which desegregated schools, so that it took another 20 years for schools to formally become desegregated. Many states actually closed public schools to prevent them from being integrated and put more effort into sponsoring private schools. A lot of churches, including Southern Presbyterian congregations, went this route and created private schools or segregation academies to serve white children only. But in the North, things are going in a different direction. In 1951, Eugene Carson Blake was elected stated clerk of the Presbyterian Church USA. He also served as president of the National Council of Churches and general secretary of the World Council of Churches. He was a very strong supporter of civil rights and really helped move the PCUSA in that direction. And in fact, he helped organize the 1963 March on Washington, and we'll see that picture in a minute. Now, in 1954, Margaret Towner, who was a Christian educator, received her bachelor's from Union Seminary in New York City. And in the following year, the Presbyterian Church USA voted to allow ordaining women as pastors. They were really one of the last Reformed bodies to do so. Now, in 1956, Towner became the first woman ordained as a pastor, although even then, her roles were very limited. Her options were limited. She mostly served as an associate pastor and a director of Christian education. She never served as a solo pastor. And I need to update it because I think she passed away recently. Now, in 1958, the UPCNA, which I mentioned, the United Presbyterian Church of North America, that ancient covenant-seceder body, voted to merge with the Presbyterian Church USA, thus becoming the United Presbyterian Church in the USA. Now, although this vote passed only by 57 to 43 in the UPCNA, only one church actually pulled out instead of joining in the merger. And Pittsburgh was chosen as the first joint General Assembly place because both denominations had seminaries there. And Pittsburgh had Pittsburgh Xenia, the UPCNA had Pittsburgh Xenia Seminary, which actually started out in Xenia, Ohio, which is how it had its name. And it merged with the PCUSA's Western Theological Seminary and is still active as Pittsburgh Theological Seminary. Now, the UPCNA was much more conservative than the PCUSA. And for the longest time, Pittsburgh was one of the more conservative seminaries, and probably still is, in the denomination. And that's a picture of the merger, the parade they had during the merger. You can see UPC USA in the center and the two preceding denominations on the other side. Now, many in the UPC USA, like their stated clerk, Eugene Carson Blake, took a vocal stand against racism and segregation. Blake himself was very much in favor of activism, and in that picture there you can see him being loaded into a police car after a civil rights demonstration in Maryland. Now, some white Presbyterians, especially those former members of the UPCNA, were upset about this shift from passive to active resistance. Carl McIntyre, who I talked a bit about last week, leader of the Bible Presbyterian Church, the guy who staged pro-Vietnam War rallies and had his own boat where he tried broadcasting stuff because the FCC got him shut down, he would actually urge churches and send them letters and get on the radio, encourage them to leave the denomination, some of which did. Many of them joined the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. In the meantime, there was talk starting up between the Southern and Northern Church about potentially reuniting, which they had been separated since the Civil War in 1861. However, when members of the Southern Church saw stuff like this, they said, "No way, we are not reuniting." And that's a picture, of course, of Dr. Martin Luther King. And to his left, our right, is Eugene Carson Blake, the stated clerk. You can tell from his very dapper hat. And that's one of my favorite pictures. In 1938, a pastor named Edgar Garnet Hawkins was ordained, and in 1964, he was elected the first black moderator of the UPC USA, the first black moderator of any really large Reformed denominations. He was also the first Protestant from the USA to visit the Pope in the 1960s. Before then, Protestant and Catholic relations, it was unheard of for a leader of a Reformed body to go and meet with the Pope, but he did. He later became a professor at Princeton Seminary. In the South, you also had some advancements being made. In 1963, the General Assembly voted to allow the ordination of women to all bodies, that included all offices, so that included both as elders and as pastors. That was ratified in 1964. Immediately, churches began ordaining women as elders because they knew they couldn't get anything done if they didn't. Now, in 1965, it took a little bit longer for a woman to get ordained as a pastor, but that was 1965. Rachel Henderlight was ordained in Richmond, Virginia, and she actually had her service at a black congregation which she had helped organize, which was really kind of unique to have the first woman be ordained at a black congregation since she was a white woman. Now, the Southern Church also adopted that same year a line to add to the Book of Order which prohibited exclusion from worship on the grounds of race, color, and class. Now, this conflicted with some policies congregations had adopted independently, barring African Americans from worship. Now, a majority of presbyteries ratified this policy, but there was still some conflict. In 1965, the General Assembly of the Southern Church was scheduled to be held at the Second Presbyterian Church in Memphis. However, the church made it clear that no black commissioners would be allowed inside. Now remember, you still had all black presbyteries who would be sending commissioners. Now, they encouraged the church to reconsider, but at this time, elders in the Southern Church were still being elected to lifetime office. Instead of rotating on and off session, if you were elected an elder, you were on session for life. So, you couldn't just move some of these old elders or wait for them to roll off and put new elders on instead. And in fact, the General Assembly ended up moving to Montreat that summer instead of holding it in Memphis. This resulted in a schism within Second Memphis, and with segregationists actually leaving and forming their own church, which continued to bar black parishioners well into the 1980s, which was very late. Later that year, Dr. Martin Luther King spoke at Montreat for the Christian Action Conference. The reaction was brutal. I'll tell you that, at least in South Carolina. The amount of letters and just threats to leave the denomination that came after he spoke were really astronomical. But you also had some very supportive letters, particularly from black clergy, who were very much in favor of this. By the 1960s, more and more of these black presbyteries were being dissolved, and the churches were being integrated into their geographic presbyteries. So, for example, here, now Third Presbyterian is a majority black congregation. They would have been in a separate presbytery. Well, they wouldn't here because, Cincinnati Presbytery was not part of the Southern Church. But just giving you an example of what it might have looked like if we had had that here, they would have eventually joined Cincinnati Presbytery instead of being in a separate presbytery. Of course, my home state of South Carolina was adamant about not doing so, and it wasn't until 1970 that they finally agreed to accept the last two churches. And that's a whole other story I could tell you about sometime. But that's a picture of the last remaining Presbyterian church that was the last one to integrate, Counselor Memorial Church in Bishopville, South Carolina. Now, not everybody agreed with this. These efforts to integrate the church, the ordination of women. People also disagreed over property and these attempts at reunion. And so some folks in the Presbyterian Church, the Southern Church, broke away and, before they broke away, they formed their own seminary, Reformed Theological Seminary in Jackson, Mississippi. Now, Reform was considered a rogue institution by the Southern Church. It did not have denominational oversight, but conservative pastors were encouraging people to go there. And because the Presbyterian Church refused to acknowledge, Reformed as being a legitimate seminary of which they'd ordained ministers from, that caused a split in the church, a massive one. In 1973, the Independent or National Presbyterian Church broke away, which was renamed the following year to the Presbyterian Church in America. That is still an active denomination. It is the second largest Presbyterian body in the country. There are a few churches around here, and they still are much more conservative. They've obviously backed off on the racial issues, although there's some interesting history there as well. They still refuse to ordain women as elders, however, and that's kind of their big thing that sets them apart from us. The PCA continued to expand. From churches both from the South and from the North, and also from the Dutch Reformed Church. Now, in 1982, the Reformed Presbyterian Church Evangelical Synod, another long name, which had broken away from the Bible Presbyterian Church, merged with the PCA, giving them more strength. Now, in 1983, the PCA split again into the Reformed Presbyterian Church in the United States, which further split for no good reason. I mean, seriously, no good reason. They split in 1991. And they've gone through a couple other splits since. They have 4 or 5 very small bodies, which are considered kind of descendants, so to speak, of the PCA. You had some more, the American Reformed Presbyterian Church, which said that you can't have images of Christ in your church because they thought that was blasphemy. You had various others that were formed. The latest one is the Vanguard Presbyterian Church, which was formed in 2020 in opposition to supposed liberalism in the PCA. Mainly their big concern was that in 2020, amidst the George Floyd protests and everything, the PCA acknowledged their racial history and acknowledged that they were founded by folks who were opposed to integration. Well, that made a lot of folks unhappy, and they broke away and formed the Vanguard Presbyterian Church. Back in the PCUSA, folks continued to look towards reunion with the Southern Church. And in 1938, a man named Lawrence Bottoms had been ordained by the PCUS. He was a black member of Louisville Presbytery, the only black member. And in 1963, he became the moderator of Louisville Presbytery, which was very unique for a black person to be moderator of an all-white presbytery. He served as a director of what they called Negro work at that time, work for African Americans. And in 1974, broke another barrier by becoming the first black moderator of the Southern Church. Another important woman at this time was Katie Geneva Cannon, who was a graduate of Presbyterian institutions and became the first black woman to be ordained in the UPC-USA, the Northern Church. And she really was a trailblazer in theology. She was a professor at my own seminary, Union. She passed away a few years before I started, but that picture was hanging on the wall, and I passed by it every day. Really a really great woman. The Southern Church, by the way, never ordained any black women as pastors. As elders, yes, but never as a pastor. Now, Thelma Davidson Adair became the first moderator of the UPC-USA General Assembly, the first black woman to serve as a moderator. And she passed away a couple years ago. She was 103, just a few weeks away from her 104th birthday. I never got to meet her, unfortunately, though she lived in North Carolina, but really a really cool woman. There's a picture of her in 2020. She was in the newspaper at 100 years old, voting in the election, and she was in a wheelchair, her COVID mask over her face. A really, really good picture. Now, one of the issues that came up in the Northern Church was in I can't remember the exact presbytery it was in, but someplace, it's either New York or Philadelphia, where there were 2 cases of ordinations that people thought were handled incorrectly. In 1974, Wynn Kenyon was ordained as a pastor, but he made it clear that he opposed women's ordination. Although the presbytery ordained him, there was an appeal made to the synod, and they overruled his ordination, and so he sought ordination in another body because he refused to acknowledge women's ordination. Well, several years later, that same presbytery ordained a guy named Mansfield Caseman who openly denied the divinity of Christ. And his ordination was upheld, which still surprises me, to be honest. And I myself disagree with his ordination, but there were those who really felt it was unfair that this one guy had his ordination overturned while this other guy was ordained. So that was the impetus for breaking away and forming the Evangelical Presbyterian Church from the Northern body. Now, they are probably the third largest Presbyterian body in the country. There are a couple congregations around here. The thing that really makes them stand out is they were much more accepting of charismatic theology. And throughout the 1980s, there were stories about them having, public exorcisms and stuff like that, speaking of tongues in services, which you really don't find in any other Presbyterian body. Even some of the other conservative ones, like the PCA, you don't find that there. Also, unlike the PCA, it allows the ordination of women but does not mandate it. Churches can decide whether or not they want to have women elders. I know of one church in South Carolina that was PCA, then went EPC because they wanted to have women elders. Presbyteries, so it's up to them to decide whether they want to ordain women as ministers, however. So some presbyteries allow it, but even if you're a woman ordained in one presbytery, your ordination may not be recognized in another part of the country. You also, of course, had an increase in Korean Presbyterians, which I talked about a couple classes ago. You had huge Presbyterian missions in Korea, and to this day, there are more Presbyterians in South Korea than there are in the United States. And the Presbyterian Church in Korea by the 1950s had been established and had gone through its own split in 1959. But in 1965, the U.S. abolished its ancient quota system, which put limits on the amount of Koreans who could come to this country. So over the following decades, you had a huge amount of immigrants from Korea who were coming to the U.S. And so they began establishing their own churches. And it was the PCA that actually first established a Korean language presbytery. It wasn't until the following year that the PCUSA followed through and did that themselves. And they continued to be more conservative on social issues. Now in 1983, after 122 years of being separate, the two denominations, Northern and Southern Presbyterian churches, merged. And this was a huge deal. A lot of folks in the Southern Church left the denomination at that time, joined the PCA, the EPC, and the Associate Reformed Presbyterian Church, which dates back to the 1820s. They come from that same covenant seceder tradition that the UPCNA came from. But it took a few years for presbytery boundaries to be finalized, and that was a big source of contention in the South, where you had black and white churches right up the road from each other. That had been the Northern Church and then the Southern Church. And both sides were scared of losing their power. So it was a very contentious process, and it took really a couple decades before churches really began and pastors began to really trust each other in some of these new presbyteries. And reunion was even, they had, in a couple places, they even rented out movie theaters when they were able to watch recordings of the General Assembly there. Now, since reunion, there's been a lot of work done in the Presbyterian Church USA. In 1974, in the Northern Church, More Light Presbyterians had been founded, which was joined in 97 by the Covenant Network, both of which still exist. They advocate for the ordination and inclusion of LGBT people. They pretty much have the same mission, though. The Covenant Network is maybe a little bit more moderate than the More Light is. And, of course, in 2012, ordination of openly gay ministers was allowed, which in 2014 was followed by the allowance of same-sex marriage. A lot of people were upset about this, which formed, guess what? Another split. Well, I'll get to that in a second. Attendance at non-denominational evangelical seminaries really started to flourish. You had the Presbyterian Lay Committee, which had been opposing these efforts for the longest time. They kind of formed the Fellowship Committee in 2011, which still exists. And more recently, you've had the Presbyterians for the Kingdom, which I talked about a couple weeks ago, which is a younger, very far-right group that is opposing a lot of this sort of stuff. But a lot of members of the fellowship community left in 2012 and 2014 and joined the Evangelical Covenant Order of Presbyterians, which, apart from their positions on LGBT people, are virtually the same as the PCUSA. They ordain women to all different offices of the church. You still had some that joined the EPC. You still have some that joined the EPC today. I can't remember if First Harrison, if they joined ECO or the EPC, but they joined one of these denominations last year. Now, back in the PCUSA, in 2016, James Herbert Nelson made history as the first black stated clerk of the PCUSA. of any mainline Reformed body, actually. And he was succeeded in 2022 by Bronwyn Boswell, who became the first woman to be a stated clerk, that she was only interim. I knew her when she was the executive presbyter of Shenandoah Presbytery in Virginia. I actually did some supply work when she was the executive presbyter there. And in 2024, they elected a full-time stated clerk, Ji-Hoon Oh, who is the first Korean American and first woman elected to hold the office of stated clerk. So that wraps up our history of the Presbyterian Church USA and the United Church of Christ. Despite our technical issues, we still have about 15 minutes. So are there any questions, any thoughts?